The wall groaned as wind pressed its vast weight against the ice, a slow complaint like a ship's timber in a winter storm. Jon Snow paused beneath the shadow it cast over the yard, his breath a pale ghost in the gray air. Ghost ranged ahead, silent and white, nose lifted, tail low, snowflakes caught in the direwolf's whiskers, pinpricks of light against deep red eyes. Something in the wind carried a nervous shiver, a burr beneath the skin of the day. The yard should have been all the old comforts. Hammer on anvil from the smithy, the hiss of breath from men at the butts, Dolorous Ed's voice dragging humor behind it like a broken sled. Instead, the sounds came muffled, wary. Men paused mid-stroke to glance over their shoulders. Even the ravens kept to their roosts and muttered to themselves, black lumps against a pallid sky. "You feel it too," Jon told Ghost. The dire wolf looked back, held his gaze a moment, and padded on. Melisandre waited for him at the foot of the steps. The Red Woman stood barehead, her hair a banner against the snow, her ruby at her throat an ember in the cold. Steam lifted from the breath of the guards around the king's tower. None dared step too near her. "You should not walk alone, Lord Commander," she said. "The snow hides many prints. I don't walk alone." Ghost circled her once and stopped, wary but curious. Her mouth curved. "No, you do not." She lifted her eyes toward the wall, and for an instant the pale sky seemed to mirror the red of her gaze. "The night is nearer than men see, and nearer still are the knives of those who name themselves your brothers." "You've said that," said Jon. "Daggers in the dark, traitors wrapped in black. The riddle fits too many." "Riddles are a poor meal," Melisandre allowed. "But fire shows in shapes, not letters. I see a hand that trembles as it strikes. I see a builder's mallet left in snow. I see men who warm their courage with words like old socks. They will choose their hour soon. If you know their names, give them. If I name too many, it will be as naming none. If I name too few, others will take up their work. A lord must do as a lord does, not as a priest tells him. But I came to say this. If you must cut, cut swiftly and in the sight of all. Sever the rot so the rot cannot spread." Jon glanced toward the yard, where Iron Emmett corrected a recruit's stance with a tap to the calf. Leathers barked at another boy to keep his chin down. Tormund Giantsbane crossed the far side in a bearskin cloak, laughing at something one of his raiders said. The sound veered too loud and died too fast. "A lord must do as a lord does," Jon repeated. The words tasted like frost. "And what I do will be for the watch." Melisandre's smile was bleak and unreadable. "You speak as if the watch and you are separate. When men cry out against what you will do, they will not say the watch betrayed them. They will say Snow did." She touched his sleeve with a hand hot as coals. "If you bleed tomorrow, it will be from a wound given today." He left her beneath the wall and climbed the steps, the iron cold through his glove. At the top, the wind was a blade that shaved heat from his bones. He looked east. The world fell away into ridges and forests, white upon white, until the sky swallowed it. Somewhere beyond the range of any eye, Hardhome crouched against a dead sea, and dead things moved within the water. Cotter Pike's last letter had been a smear of ash and fear. Dead things in the bay, dead things on the shore, the fire's going out. If the knives come before I act, there will be no Hardhome. There will be no watch worth the name. Ed found him at the parapet, shrugged up in his patched cloak, snow rhyming the dark stubble on his jaw. "You wanted word if Wick Whittlestick set foot in the kitchens again." Jon turned, feeling the wall shift subtly beneath his boots. And he did." Dolorous Ed squinted into the wind. "Went in with empty hands, came out with something the cook says wasn't his. Funny thing about Wick, he's too proud to steal bread. I'll wager half a dried fish it wasn't bread." "Tell Hob to give Wick as much bread as he likes," said Jon. "I want Wick fat and slow if he must be anything." Ed's mouth twitched. "Best I've got is stale and slow. Also, Bowen Marsh has been meeting with Othel near the builder's yard at hours sensible folk are in bed. Might be they're discussing how to fell trees by starlight." "They always could do that," said Jon. But they had the courtesy to hate me separately. Ed said. Nothing like union to put a man on edge. John rested his gloved hands on the rim of stone. Round up Iron Emmett, Leathers, Rory, and Harl the huntsman. Quietly and not all at once. Tormund too, and fetch Satin. Then send for the horn to call all brothers to the shield hall at noon. Neck deep in snow and speeches, Ed lamented. My joy runneth over. Ed. The steward paused. If I fall, you take the men to the yards and hold the gate. You take Ghost if he'll go. You bar the king's tower and send to Eastwatch. And you don't give anyone a clear throat to talk through. I was born to be unhappy, Ed said drily, but not so unhappy as to bury you. Don't fall, John. When the horn sounded, its moan rolled like thunder along the stone. Men tumbled in from every corner of Castle Black, old bearers of scars and boys who had never held a sword outside the practice yard. Southron Sellswords turned sober by cold, builders with numb hands, stewards with ink-stained fingers, a few with the look of wolves who had not learned to smile. They filed into the shield hall in a rustle of wool and leather. The hall had been built for speeches, for oaths and the simple theater of authority. Its rafters were old black beams, and its walls carried the names of the dead. Breath clouded the air as men arranged themselves in uneven rows on the long benches and against the walls. At the high end, a dais held a chair scarred by a century of backsides and boots. John wore no heavy cloak for the moment. He wanted the cold. He wanted it sharp to keep his head. Ghost stalked the aisle behind him and then took a seat along the side where he could see the hole, still as frost. Bowen Marsh stood with the stewards, pale beneath his hood. Othel Yarwick loomed near the builders, a thick man with a thick neck and hands like mallets. Wick Whittlestick tried for a corner and found none. Sir Alistair Thorne had chosen a place near the aisle, arms folded, mouth thin. He was one of the Watch's oldest grudges given flesh and black wool. His eyes glittered when they found John, not with challenge now, but with a cold flavor of patience. John looked once to Melisandre. She stood unobtrusive near the rear, half drowned in black cloaks. The ruby at her throat warmed and cooled in the gray light like a heartbeat. My brothers, John said, and the hall quieted. We are few. You can count the crows at Castle Black quicker than the fleas on a dog. The living fall, and the dead rise, and every morning there is more white upon the fields. Eastwatch calls for aid. Cotter Pike writes of dead men who do not drown. If Hardhome falls, we will count our numbers against a sea of hands that do not tire. He let the words settle. Let men remember the night the first wave of free folk had come through the gate, gaunt as hunger, carrying children who would not wake. We have brought wildlings through the wall, he went on. We have given them bread. We have given them the old words of peace at our gate. Some of you hate that. Some of you hate me for it. He who does not like the taste may spit. He who would spit in my face may try. But listen before you spit, and see truth before you blind yourself. He nodded once. Leathers and Iron Emmett moved, flanking Wick Whittlestick, whose eyes went large as coins. Wick Whittlestick, John said. The name is sharp as the little man's knife. Last night you followed a path not your own. You stole through the back of the armory and waited in the shadows near my steps. When Ghost came sniffing, you went away. You returned later, carrying a knife the cook says went missing from his work table. When the steward Rory stepped to speak to you, you cut him. Gasps rippled through the hall like wind crossing a pond. Wick swallowed. He grabbed me. He, Lord Commander. Rory wears stitches this morning, John said. I counted them myself. He bleeds for us still. Iron Emmett twisted Wick's arm until the knife clattered to the stone. It was the plain kind a man kept for sausage and rope, but clean, honed to the hunger of intent. And you, Bowen Marsh, John said. The first steward's eyes darted. Lord Commander, I have served the watch since. Since and before, John said. Yet a man with so many years should know better than to meet to plan the murder of his lord. The novice who happened past the builder's yard last night heard talk fat with old wrongs and new resolves. He did not understand every word. He is a boy. Boys miss much. But he understood enough to fetch the right ears. A hand rose in the crowd. "Lord Commander," Othel Yarwick said. His voice carried the weight of moor and wood, the slowness of a man who takes care with how he breaks his bread. If a man says a thing in anger, it's not always the thing he'll do. Marsh is angry. You've given him cause. Many of us are angry with you. There's ways to set a thing right that ain't blood. Are there? John said. Show me the path that leads from words to obedience without passing through treachery, and I'll bow to your builder's craft. But we haven't time for soft mending. Men plot. Men reach for knives. The dead don't pause to ask if we feel better about our choices. He took a breath. Ser Alicer. Thorn's lips barely moved. My lord, you taught me how to hate a man's face and still keep my knife edge square upon him. You taught me, in your fashion, that the watch must be iron. I taught you to keep your mouth shut and your eyes open, Thorn said. His gaze slid toward Bowen Marsh. And to cut rot from a wound before it spreads. Then you'll agree when I say, when treason draws its breath to speak, a man must take that breath from it. A murmur swelled, then broke against silence again. Men's feet shifted. A hand brushed the hilt of a sword. The smell of damp wool and fear sharpened. John made himself look into the faces. Karstark men with Val among them, Tormund's raiders, thin-cheeked boys whose first snow still clung to them, old hands whose knuckles showed white above cords of scars. He saw doubt. He saw hunger for certainty. He saw a stubborn frontier between. The watch is not a debating circle, John said. We swear our oaths to the wall and to each other. We do not stab in the dark, and we do not conspire to. I won't have the words for the watch turned into a prayer a murderer mutters to ease his mind. Leathers hauled Wick forward. Iron Emmett stepped behind Bowen Marsh, heavy hands on his shoulders. Othel did not resist when Rory and Harl moved to either side of him. His tiny thin smile told a story he might never have intended, of a man who had spoken too long and not been heard, and so raised his voice until it became a hammer. I will hear a word from each of you, John said. If I pass sentence, I will strike the blows myself. I was taught no other way. Othel's eyes flicked to the sword at John's side. Longclaw's pommel caught the light, the carved wolf seeming to breathe. Old ways, Othel said, and I remember Lord Eddard brought them south once. We're all colder for it. Speak plain, said John. The free folk killed my brother, Othel said. The first time I saw a raider, I was little more than boy. He took our cows. He took my sister's ears for pretty. There's men sitting in your hall now who would have done the same to the other ear if you'd not told them where to sit. When I said the thing that got a boy's ears pricked last night, I was speaking of those years. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I've carried that weight a long time. You bring them through. You bed them in our bunks. You set them to our drills. A man grows angry. That's a truth if one of your red gods says it or not. John nodded. Anger is a truth. Treachery is a choice. Bowen Marsh. Marsh licked his lips. His hands twisted together in a clasp that had no prayer to it. My lord, he murmured, and his voice broke. My lord, forgive. If I spoke madness, it was only fear. I thought you meant to lead us against Winterfell. The letter. The pink letter had arrived 2 days past, sealed in pale wax. The words within had stunk of dogs and vain pride and a child's thirst for cruelty. Ramsay's laugh had lived between the lines. The letter demanded hostages and returns like a butcher demanding his own cleaver back. It had named Mance Raider, and that cut deep as winter. I will never lead the watch in a lord's war, John said, but I will not suffer a bastard of Bolton to take and flay the men I have promised guest right to protect. I will answer the letter by telling the North Plain that if they wish the realm safe, they must turn their eyes to the dark that comes from beyond the wall. That is not treachery to our vows. Bowen's eyes filled. I only wish to keep the old ways, he whispered. John thought of an old man on a high seat, a man who had spoken of the old ways and then gone to his death on a green hill. Old ways kept us warm, he said softly, until the wind changed. Then they kept us dead. He gestured. Wick was dragged forward to the space before the dais. Bowen Marsh followed, stumbling. Othel Yarwick took his place without prompting. A fourth man, broad-shouldered and thick through the waist, tried to melt into the crowd. Iron Emmett drew him forth with a hand in his collar. Alf of Runnymud clenched his jaw and did not meet John's eyes. "Sir Alistair Thorne," John said, "will you speak against these men? Will you speak for them?" Thorne's mouth curled. "I will speak for the watch," he said. "If a man must be punished, punish him. But remember this." He lifted his chin toward the rafters as if speaking to the dead whose names hung behind him. "Every time you let a wildling share our fire, you teach a boy who grew up running from their shadows not to trust the light. You asked us to swallow stones, Lord Commander. For some men, the stone sticks. That does not make them traitors. Plotting murder does," John said.
"Stand aside, Sir Olyser."
Longclaw came free with the sigh of winter. The blade was a darker gray than the day, near black in the light. John felt the weight familiar and true in his hands, not heavy, not light. A thing perfected to its work. He stepped to Wick first. The little man trembled and tried to stiffen against it, jaw up, eyes bulging. John thought of the boy Rory sprawled beneath the lintel, lips split, teeth knocked out, blood thread-thin down his chin. "Wick Whittlestick," he said, "for drawing a blade upon a brother and conspiring to murder your lord, I sentence you. I carry it out now." Wick's mouth opened, a fish desperate for a wider sea. "Mercy," he breathed. "May the gods find it if they will," John said, and made the cut clean. The hall exhaled. Wick folded into himself and slid away from the world. A speck of red struck the rushes and sank into them like a seed. Bowen Marsh sagged even as men stepped to hold him upright. "I loved the watch," he sobbed. "I loved the watch. I have known no other love." John's chest tightened. The fat tears on Marsh's cheeks froze into gleam. "And you betrayed it," John said. "As a man may betray a woman he swears to keep. That does not make the oaths we speak a folly. It makes our failings heavier. Bowen Marsh, for treason to your vows, I sentence you. I will see your burden ended." Marsh's lips formed a prayer, and then he tried for words John did not let him have. Longclaw hissed. Marsh fell as if asleep in a chair too long. Othel Yarwick met John's eyes. "I spoke wrong," he said. "I should have put my words to wood." He closed his eyes. "Do what you built yourself to do, Snow." John did. He tried to make it as quick as a nail driven straight and hard. Alf of Runnymud kicked at Iron Emmett's grip but could not break it. He spat at John, a string of saliva freezing before it hit the stones. "You'll die for this," he said, voice thick as snowmelt. "You'll die and it'll be for nothing." "It may be so," John said. "It will not be by your hand." When he was done, he stepped back. The rush of sound that followed seemed smaller than the hall, small even as breathing. "Leathers," John said, wiping the sword clean on a cloth Ed offered. "Harl, see to the—" He paused, groping for a word he could endure and finding none better than "bodies. Give them to the earth beyond the ditch. They swore the same words we did once. They will rest near the wall." Men looked at one another, at the patches of red darkening like wine. Ghost stood, shook himself, and padded to John's side. He nosed John's sleeve and then the sword, and then lifted his head and bared his teeth at a smell John could not place. Across the hall, the red woman's ruby burned. Sir Alistair stepped forward. "You've shown iron," he said, voice even. "You've shown a boy he can put on a lord's cloak and not drown in it." His gaze moved across the men, testing, measuring. "The watch stands because it does what other men won't. See that you know the difference between what men won't and what men shouldn't." "Stand down, sir," John said. He sheathed Longclaw. A tremor had crept into his arms, light as a leaf on water. He held them still by will. "There will be changes. We can't do without a first builder or a first steward. I appoint Ed Tollett as acting steward. He will keep the stores and the lists and put his eye to the men and their needs. Leathers will take training in hand with Iron Emmett. We'll choose a new first builder from among those who can raise a wall that does not fall when a man leans on it, and who can bite his own tongue when his anger is bigger than his sense." There was a flash of grim amusement then, quick as a raven's wing. Men could do nothing with death that was not grief, but they could do something with the work that followed. They could add it to the pile and heave. When the hall had emptied to a steady stream, while the last of them fetched stretchers and ropes and muttered their prayers to whatever gods kept company with murdered oaths, Melisandre came to him. "You took their heads," she said, as if remarking on a snowfall. "Not their tongues, not their hands. That is mercy of a sort." "It is justice," Jon said. "It is the balance of a blade, nothing more." She glanced toward the open door where the light was turning thinner, weaker, stretched across the yard. "Their friends will swallow now. Some will choke. Some will learn to eat. And some will find their hunger turned to another need." "Let them," Jon said. "There are worse hungers. The dead are always hungry." "You have made a shape in the snow," Melisandre said. "Snow remembers shapes when wind comes. Be ready to trace it again and again, until your hand knows it without your head." She let her eyes rest upon Ghost. "If you had not acted, I would be finding the warmth for my next vision in a pool of your blood. This is the path we must walk if we do not want to wade." Ed returned with snow caked to his boots and hands pink with cold. "I've already made friends for life, my lord," he muttered. "Nothing like wrapping a man's head in sacking to bring you close." Jon shut his eyes only for a heartbeat. "Have the yard cleared. I want the heads set on the inner wall until nightfall. Want the men to see. Then we'll carry them to Earth." "Aye," said Ed. "We'll see if we can find some earth under all this beautiful white." That night the wind went quiet and the silence folded around Castle Black like a glove. Jon slept in his chamber above the armory with the door barred and Ghost curled at the threshold. Dreams came thick and strange. He stood atop a cliff of ice, and below him a black sea moved with the slowness of something that could afford to be patient. Faces floated in the water, rising and falling without making ripple. Wick, Marsh, Othel, Alf, and then others, girls he had not known. Men who had died at the fist, a pale queen with a crown of frost, a child with a stag's shadow in his eyes. When he looked up, a red star hung in a sky that had lost its blue. It gave no heat. He woke to a raven's racket and the smell of smoke. For a moment he was 14 again, shivering in Winterfell's yard as Lord Eddard's blade fell somewhere beyond a line of taller men. Then he was 22 and remembered that he had become the tall men. "Letters," Ed announced, pushing the door with his unfortunate nose. "You know the things. Folded lies wrapped in wax." Jon took the topmost. The seal bore the merman of Manderley and the wax smelled faintly of spice. Wyman wrote with a softness that could be mistaken for fat. He spoke of snow and patience and fishermen whose nets hauled up shoes instead of fish. He offered no men, only words that might fatten into promises if a spring ever came. Another letter bore the tree of Smallwood in a hand too eager by half. The third smelled of smoke. The pink wax had been pressed with a flayed man. He broke it, read, and did not allow his hand to close around the page so hard it would crumple. Ramsay's words tittered. He claimed victory over Stannis on a field of snow. He claimed furs from men Jon had known at the wall. He demanded Mance, demanded the queen and her daughter and her fool priest and the red witch in Jon's head for good weight. He promised skins for Jon's friends to wear if they came to Winterfell as supplicants. Jon set the letter aside, slow. Ed watched him, face unreadable as ever. The hearthvine fire popped and shifted, a log collapsing into coals. "If I were a praying man," Ed said, "I would say a prayer about now and offend the lot of them at once just to be sure." "I'll write," Jon said. His voice felt like a stranger's in his mouth. "And in the writing choose the course that will not break us. We will not ride upon Winterfell as a lord's host. We will not kneel. We will not answer his boasts with our own. We will do what we swore to do, and save as many lives as we can from what moves in the north." "You're not going to like the shape those words take," Ed said. "No," said Jon. "I am not. He left the room and followed the stairs down through the armory. The morning bit clear and bitter. The heads were gone from the wall, the snow smoothed. Men crossed the yard with their eyes on the ground. No one spoke of what they had seen. John found Tormund Giant's Bane near the stables, one big hand stroking a shag of mane as if to remind himself what horses were for. "You did what had to be done," Tormund said at once, as if he too were done with talk that circled. He spat and then laughed softly at the way it froze before it hit the snow. "We have a word for it, the then's use. They say a man must be sharpened on other men or he goes dull. I've been a dull knife some winters. You've got the edge now." "I don't need words," John said. "I need boats. I need men to steer them, and men to pull in others from the surf." Tormund's eyes glinted. "Hard home," he said. His coarse thumb found a burr in the horse's mane and worked it away. "A bad place now, Snow. Bad as old stories. But my people are there. Your people too, if you'll have them." "I said I would," John answered. "We will go by Eastwatch. I won't just send men and wait for letters that smell of fear. I want to see what waits there. I want to see if it can be fought in boats and on the shore. You want to lay your eyes on the thing that walks behind your dreams." Tormund grinned. All broken tusks and genuine animal pleasure at the thought of work well done. I will go. You'll need eyes upon the water that aren't afraid to stare back. And men who won't stick there or in their own foot." By evening he had sent ravens to Eastwatch and the Shadow Tower, and one to White Harbor with words he hoped would chafe a fat lord into motion without making him drop his goblet. He went to the Queen's Tower and found Celis Baratheon enthroned before a brazier as if attending court in summer. Shireen sat near, a book open on her knees. Her lips moved, tracing a line with a dirty fingernail, patient as snowfall. A fool of a man in motley sang a song too quietly for his song to be anything but a humming nervousness. "Your Grace," John said, bowing just enough. "You made a mess," she said by way of greeting. "My guards spoke of blood and heads. Do you mean to do the same with my men next?" "If they plot to kill me," John said, her mouth pinched into a sour almond. "When Stannis returns, he will want the first answer as to why you did what you did. When he returns," John said gently, "I will give it to him." He held Celis' eyes. "I mean to go to Eastwatch and from there to Hardhome." "Then you mean to die," Celis said. "You men of the North have a very particular taste for useless bravery. It is like eel pie, acquired in childhood and clung to ever after. I mean to bring the living to the wall. So if I die, Your Grace, it will not be useless." He bowed again. "Shireen," he said to the girl, and she smiled shyly without quite looking up, as if the habit of avoiding unkind eyes was too strong to break for a kind one. Melisandre watched him go from the far side of the brazier. The flames gave her face a curious softness he had never seen in cold light. "I will see what I can see for you upon the water," she said later, catching his sleeve in the courtyard. "But remember this, Lord Commander. Fire walks poorly upon the sea. It may be there are things that move better where fire drowns." "Then I will bring rope," John said. "And a long hook." Eastwatch welcomed them with ropes that burned the hands and a wind that bit even through sealskin. The sea beyond the pale wall of the harbor was a crust that broke and crusted again, ice drifting like the ribs of dead leviathans. Cotter Pike's face looked like it had been carved from knotted rope softened with salt and age. He grabbed John by the forearm. "I told you," he said. "I told you. There's fish in the nets that don't smoke when you put them on the fire. They flop and flop, and when you strike them they don't bleed right. That's not the worst. The worst is the men who walk out of the water and don't cough." "How many?" John asked. "Enough to make a prayer stupid," Pike said. He jerked his head toward the boats rocking at their moorings. "I've men to row and axes that don't rust for the looking. But there's a frost upon the sea that takes en or like it takes a man's breath. You step 2 feet wrong and you're food for things that don't eat." Tormund cracked his great hands. "Then we'll step right." They took 3 cogs and a handful of smaller boats when the weather opened a slip. The sky hung low, heavy with unshed snow, and the sea wore a skin of smashed ice like scabs. John stood at the prow and Ghost beside him, fur clumped with salt spray. The dire wolf lifted his head and growled at water. Tormund swung a song that was more like a threat than a melody. The free folk joined in, and somehow it helped, threads thrown into a net to remind men they were still men. Hardhome rose out of the fog like a splintered tooth. The great palisade was coated in rime, the black gate thrown open, one hinge cracked and the other twisting like an old man's back. The beach beyond was dung-colored with old campfires and dead wood. The first sound was the slap of waves against the strand. The second was the empty clatter of something falling over itself. "Keep close," John said. "No one runs alone. No one." They moved through the wreckage of a rushed camp. Circles of stones where fires had been, the marks of small feet, gnawed bones that could have been pig and might not have. The air stank of old smoke and wet fur and a sweetness John did not name. A gull cried and veered off, offended by the lack of anything it could make sense of. They found the first of them by the water's edge, a woman folded around a child, both of them ash pale. When they turned them over, the child's eyes were open and blind, the mother's mouth rimmed with frost as if she had bitten it and it had bitten back. Tormund swore once, softly. "Not these," Cotter Pike said. "We saw ones that walked. They told us they were taken inland." A skinny man murmured. A free folk raider who had made it to Eastwatch 2 years passed on a stolen boat and burned the boat rather than let it go back to sea without him. "They said the dead like the woods. They said they drag folk up into the trees when the fog comes heavy. The dead like whatever we do not," John said, and moved deeper. He heard them before he saw them, the slick of ice on wood, the faint click of teeth. When the fog parted, he saw a tide of shapes moving slow and eager, a crowd with faces like old cheese, eyes pale as glass. They did not hurry. They did not need to. They came on in a silence broken only by their own awkwardness. A little girl at the front crawled not because she could not walk, but because crawling brought her closer to the smell of heat. "Back to the boats," John said. "Hold together." They held as men held when fear became a white fire. Tormund swatted a dead man aside with his axe and then planted the axe in another's neck. Stayed there, the neck sticky with cold and wrong. The man kept coming, dragging the axe with him until Tormund tore it free and took the head. Ghost darted and lunged, faster than fear, throwing himself at the throat of a bearded corpse that came on with arms stretched. His teeth sank deep. He shook until the head came loose, and then he bounded away before the hands could close around his fur. "Fire!" John shouted. "Fire, you thick-footed goats!" Arrows hissed through the air. Some had heads of dragonglass, painfully hoarded, and those turned dead flesh to something that knew it was dead again. Men with torches ran along the flanks, tripping and swearing. A dead woman with half a scalp swatted one torched man from his feet and then fell upon him. John reached her in 3 strides and sent Longclaw across her shoulder into her spine. Bone jarred the blade. She tried to rise without legs, finally conceding to death with a sigh that had no breath in it. The white fog behind the dead shifted. Shapes moved within it, taller, fine as bone, light rippling along their edges as if the air itself had been ground to glass. The temperature dropped so sharply John felt the moment his breath stopped smoking because it could no longer leave him warm. Another stepped out where the fog thinned. Its eyes were a color that did not belong to any name men gave colors. Took no care as it moved, because care was for slower things. In its hand, a spear of blown ice made sound like a singing thing when it cut the air. "Back!" Cotter Pike rasped, voice raw. He took an arrow from the man next to him and fumbled it to his string. His fingers had forgotten what it meant to be made of meat. "Back, you idiots!" John stepped in. There was nothing brave in it. It was the only place to stand. Longclaw shivered against his palm, as if the blade recognized a friend it had cut once and would cut again. The other watched him as a man watches a dog that thinks itself a wolf. It lunged, and he moved, and the spear's point skipped along the edge of his parka and kissed his skin beneath. A chill plunged into him, stealing sensation as cheaply as a cut purse steals a purse whose owner has fallen asleep drunk. He struck, and where the black steel met the clear substance of the spear, Frost screamed. The other turned its weapon in a flick and sent a spray of fine ice at his face. It was only by the habit of fear that he closed his eyes and did not lose them. He slashed low, a black wave crossing a bank of snow, and took the other through its thigh. It dropped as a statue might drop if robbed of the stone that made it leg. It rolled, fluid and terrible, and brought the spear up under his chin. He saw himself reflected there. A pale boy with a man's mouth, eyes too old. Ghost hit the other from the side like a storm breaking. His jaws closed on the thing's arm, and for an instant Ghost's teeth smoked. He yelped, but he did not let go. John brought Longclaw down two-handed. The blade passed through the other as if cutting water, and yet when it emerged, the thing had come apart. Frost blew outward, stinging like thrown sand. The spear clattered and shattered. The air tasted of something very old and very tired. The dead that had been pressing them staggered as if their strings had been tugged from the wrong direction. Some fell. Some bowed as if listening. A few went mad for a moment, striking at each other. It was enough. They gained the boats with half the people they had come for, and as many again as luck and fury could stuff into holds and the spaces beneath benches. As the oars dug, a second other moved along the bluff above, watching with a stillness that wanted to be called thought. It lifted no weapon. It did not follow. The fog closed again. On the water, everything that was not a boat tried to become one. Fingers clutched at hulls. Faces rose just within the skin of the sea, pressed against it as if trying to breathe through it. Men struck with oars. Men reached by instinct to pull small hands up and then saw what had attached to the small hands and gagged and let go. A boy with a braid froze as he skidded on the ice, hit his head, and slid under the prow of a boat. John lunged and caught him by the collar. For a second, the weight nearly took him overboard. Then Tormund's hands found his belt and yanked him backward so hard his teeth clicked. They pulled away. The noise of the dead diminished to a farther clatter. The fog swallowed the shore. The boats rocked beneath a sky that had learned nothing and cared less. John knelt in the cramped space and tried to see the shape of what had almost happened. Ghost pressed against his knees and panted a fog of his own, tongue lolling steam. John rubbed his ears, which had gone pale from the touch with the other, and felt the heat of the direwolf's breath on his palms. 2 boats lost, Cotter Pike said, breath-raking, and 36 souls we gained. More if you count the ones who'll drown because we filled a boat to save them from freezing. That's a count a priest can use to make himself feel useful. It's a count that means there are 36 who will stand a wall and not our graves, John said. He tried to smile and failed. Do not rob me of that, Cotter. You did it, Tormund grunted. You swung your pretty sword at a pile of winter and made it fall. He clapped John's shoulder. We'll make a tale of it if we live. It will be a bad one. I don't make any other sort, but it will put heat in a man's belly. They returned to Eastwatch to fires that looked obscene for their harmless warmth. Men stumbled across decks and down gangplanks, their legs remembering land with reluctance. Children cried, which offended the air after so much silence. An old woman sat near a brazier and hummed something that had no melody because it had no teeth left to chew on. John left the counted and the cut to the men whose hands knew those tasks and went to stand on the wall that looked straight at the sea. Melisandre's letter awaited him in the tower room, a scrap smelling of smoke and cedar. The words were spare and careful. She had seen the water black and the sky like bone and the shape of him standing where the two touched. She had seen a shadow with antlers dissolving, a boy with a burning face, a woman with a cloak of wet fur standing amid the sea and the snow with her hands held out to either, deciding which to let drown. He turned the paper over as if another letter waited on the reverse. It came without knocking, as was his right now. He looked older by the day, weariness scored into his face like lines in dry earth washed with winter streams. A raven from the Shadow Tower, he said. They ask if you are dead. Tell them not yet, John said. Ed set his hands on the back of a chair, then thought better of sitting. The men are talking, he said soberly. They will never stop, John said. That is what men do when they are not fighting or eating. What do they say now? That you killed your own, Ed said. That you saved people who should have died. I did, said John. That you mean to take the black cloaks and turn them red, Ed went on. They don't know what that means. Neither do I. It sounds objectionable. It will be black as ever, John said. He stood, feeling the ache in his thighs from bracing on the boat, the ache in his forearms from the strike and recoil. But it will be larger. We filled the wall with old stories and thought that would be enough. Now we will fill it with new people who owe us something besides contempt. Some of them will, Ed said. Some of them will owe you death. Then they will pay and I will pay with them, John said. No one is debtless in winter. They rode for Castle Black with the wind in their faces. Slow because the land under the sky had become a thing that resisted being crossed. When they arrived, the snow lay high against walls and the piled drifts had been cut into lanes. The Queen's Tower looked brittle as a sugar sculpture. Celis barred the Red Woman from her sight that day and made a court of her own while her bannermen argued with the air. John left them to it. He walked the yard and spoke to men and to women who would not be made into men by a set of words. He saw Satin teaching a boy how to string a bow without breaking it. He saw Iron Emmett talking Tormund out of punching a man who had pushed a wildling girl in a food line. He saw Val, her hair wrapped close against the cold, eyes not soft and not cruel, like a hunter's in the month when game grows scarce. He saw Alice Karstark in the archway of the armory, a vexed light in her face. She looked at Sigorn, her then lord, as if reconciling two languages she had always known into one sentence. He stood where the heads had been and imagined them still there. He closed his eyes and let the image sit with him until it faded at the edges and then the center. He did not forget. Forgetting was a luxury warmer lands might allow themselves. He could not afford it. At dusk a horn sounded from the north face. It was the third horn, and it had not been blown by any living hand. Everyone in the yard stopped as if the sound had pressed a palm against each chest at once. Ghost threw back his head and howled, a long silver cry that cracked along the wall like lightning. John ran for the steps. Men he had just spoken with ran with him and past him, swore, stumbled, rose. The climb was a thing he had done so many times it felt like part of his body. Tonight it cut at his calves. He reached the top and crossed the flat, the snow here a harder, meaner thing than the snow on the ground. The world beyond the wall had gone very still. No wind moved the trees. No ravens. The sky had lost even its pale color, a gray that was maybe green. He looked north. They were there, a line along the forest edge, a stalk of pale seeds about to be dropped upon a field. Whites clustered, in masses that made men seem like an idea. Beyond them, walking among them as a hawk walks among sparrows, he saw the others. Not many. Enough. Cotter Pike joined him. The gods have sour humor, he said. We pulled folk from Dead Sea, and now Dead Land comes to fetch them back. Light the pits, John said. Let them smell what waits. Fire bloomed along the line the builders had cut and covered and filled with pitch and old greasy meat. It took with a roar and then a steady purr. The whites halted at the first shock of heat, then moved again, slower. The others came more cautiously, as if considering how to step across fire without making it into a friend. Archers, John called, and men bent their bows. Arrows feathered into the tide. Dragonglass shafts did their wicked grace. Common heads slowed, toppled, tripped, bought heartbeats. Heartbeats were coin enough in war. The first wave hit the trench and tried to cross. Some fell. Some took flame and walked burning until bone remembered that it should not move. The air smelled of scorched fat, and John refused to think of kitchens because that led to other rooms where people he had known had laughed. He saw another step into the fire and walk through it. For a heartbeat the flame bent to it as if to wind. Then it hissed and became a small pall of vapor. The other lifted one hand and the heat around John's ribs flared and went thin. He loosed a breath and saw it in a shape that told him someone else's cold was tasting it. Val stood near with a bow and the steady concentration of a woman who has already chosen the only task that matters. She drew to her ear and let the arrow fly. The obsidian head found a white near the other, and the thing dropped like an unstrung puppet. The other turned its head very slowly and seemed almost to consider appreciation. Then it moved its hand, and the bow in Val's fingers cracked in two with a sound like breaking bone. She did not flinch. She tossed the pieces aside and found another bow without looking. Tormund shouted something that might have been an insult to enemy mothers and might have been addressed to the greater powers. He swung and swung until the snow around him was trampled into a meatless paste. Iron Emmett drove a spear through a wight's open mouth and into the skull of the thing behind it. Dolorous Ed ducked and swore and somehow took a head with a cut that looked like a mistake until it wasn't. The others tested, then withdrew as a man tests a kennel and decides to try a different gait. The whites fell back. The line drifted. The night did not break. Jon stood, hands shaking from the cold and the varnish of fear. Ghost pressed along him and quivered. "We'll be doing this every evening," Ed said, coming to stand. "I only hope the dead can set a regular hour. I cannot abide impunctuality." Jon laughed then, a single bark that felt like a thing dropped from too high. "We will do it every hour if need be," he said. He looked along the wall at men with icicles on their eyelashes and the bones of their faces showing through the masks of rime. "We will be what we said we would be. No more and no less." The letter he wrote to Winterfell did not answer Ramsay's boasts. It was not meant to. It spoke of tides and fires and the cost strangers sometimes pay for a family that had called itself the North for longer than torches remembered halls. It invited the lords to send men to the wall not to fight for a king, but for a world. It offered the Watch's bread to any who would listen and their justice to any who would make murder with vows in his mouth. He sent copies to Bear Island and to White Harbor and to Last Hearth and to such lesser houses as still had a man who could read. He did not send one to Carhold. Alice had asked him not to, and he had trusted that request as he had trusted the shape of her jaw when she had made it. Men grumbled at the bread offered. Some took it and grumbled with their mouths full, which made the grumbling easier to bear. Men swore oaths and did not mean them and then found, beneath the day's labor and the night's fear, that they did. The free folk made their own sacrifices before fires, bones tossed to the flames with spat words that were half curse and half prayer. Celis complained and then went silent as her guards came to watch, because watching was better than being alone. Melisandre stood in the yard one afternoon as a flurry of snow drifted down and lifted her hands until her red sleeves billowed like new wounds. She spoke in a tongue no one knew, then fell silent, and tears slid down her cheeks and froze there. Small white beads anyone else might have mistaken for ornaments. "What did you see?" Jon asked her, close enough to share warmth and far enough not to feed her fires. "A knife made of memory," she said, voice rough. "A sword made of duty." She made a small sound, not a laugh. "Words, always words. The flames are as weary of my questions as I am of their answers." "Then set them questions they cannot avoid," Jon said, not knowing what he meant until he did. "Make funeral pyres at dawn and at dusk. Let our dead go to whatever warmth there is without waiting in the frost. But no burnings the Queen's men would call worship. This is not that. This is mercy." She inclined her head as if he had given her a gift she could keep, though they both knew she would spend it immediately. "Mercy is a kind of worship men can endure," she said. Days took on a sameness that burned. Scouts brought word of movement. Archers learned to knock with fingers numb. Men woke from dreams of a sea that would not drown them and a forest that did not wish to be silent and went to stand their hour on the wall, and sometimes stood too because a man had forgotten how to count. They buried their dead by fire and by earth both. They set aside hatred like a sack of stones that could be picked up later if necessary. In the shield hall, Jon cut old banners into bandages and listened to boys he would have sent to Old Town if the world were still a place where Old Town mattered. He wrote letters and sealed them and did not know which ravens would arrive and which would end up feeding those dark shapes that pecked at a corpse's eyes and then took wing with a caw that sounded like a jest. The first northern men came with spears too short and cloaks too thin, led by a small Jon who had left the greater part of his name in a grave and a wiser part of it in a story. He spoke grimly of winter and looked at Ghost like a man looks at a ghost. The next came from Bear Island, women with arms like roots and faces set in permanent disapproval of the fact that the world would ask them to raise sons when daughters did better. "We don't kneel to crows," their leader told John. "We kneel to the work." They took their place beside Leathers at the training ground and took the measure of his bark with their own. No men came from Last Hearth at first. When they did, they were boys with their ears red and their knuckles raw. Ravens brought other tidings, of Manderley's cooks baking more pies than a wedding required, of a crow cage at Barrowton broken in a night while snow fell hard, of a shadow in the Dreadfort's yard that never did match the man who made it. John took them all in and set them aside. The wall did not care for shadows except the one it cast. He woke one morning to find the world transformed in a way that did not change anything. Frost had sketched every wire and hinge in white. The sky held a pale coin of a sun and no warmth. The air felt like glass. Ghost stood at the foot of his bed and nosed his hand, insistent. When John went out, the yard was full of a hush that held its breath like a man counting to a number he had never reached before. On the north side, they formed again as if summoned by a sound only they heard. The others stood behind their whites like commanders behind ranks they did not really command so much as created. John took his place on the wall, Longclaw in his hand and something heavier at his back that he understood was expectation. Melisandre came to stand near, wrapped in furs whose curl of hair she did not seem to feel. "Do you have fires enough?" she asked. "No," John said, "but I have men enough to light the ones we do." She looked at him as if seeing the inside of him. "You need not be the only hand on the sword," she said. "I know," he said, "but I am the one that is." She nodded once, as if she had wanted only to be sure he understood his own sentence. Tormund took his place with a laugh that showed no mirth and thumped the toe of his axe against the frost until it did not stick. The others moved, and the whites moved with them. The fire pits blazed, but the wind came sharp and sheared the flames down until they ducked their heads like men under orders. Arrows fell. Some found targets. Some skittered away. The first white to reach the top of the ladder lost its hands to Ed's sword and kept coming. John took the head. The body walked 2 steps and then tried to decide what its legs were for. "Down," he said to the men near him. "Down and hold the inner gate. If they take the top of the wall, they take only wind." He did not know if it was the right call. He made it as if it were. They descended into the belly of the wall, lanterns throwing mad shadows. The tunnel that stabbed the ice felt like a throat swallowing them. At the inner gate, men formed up into lines that were not straight and became straighter because they had someone to follow. John stood at the center where the worst of the press would come if the worst came. Ghost bared his teeth at the darkness and shook himself, as if to fling off what might stick. When the gate boomed with the first blow from the far side, the sound was like a drum played by a god with poor rhythm and patience. The wood held. The iron held. The second blow came harder. Splinters jumped. A third made the torches shiver. Men murmured whatever made sense to them. Names of mothers, of wives, of children, of gods. Ed hummed something under his breath that might have been an obscene body and might have been a lullaby. It sounded much alike. The gate shuddered, and then the braces bent, and then the first plank cracked. Through the ragged places came fingers blue with frost and stiff with something that imitated life with malicious talent. John lifted Longclaw in his hands and nodded to Tormund. The big man grinned as if someone had reminded him how to move. When the first white forced itself through, they met it as a rock meets a wave. The dead hand clawed at John and he turned his shoulder to it, letting it catch cloth and not skin. He struck and struck. If he had ever thought sword work a dance, he now learned what a dance is when the floor turns to ice and a man keeps moving because to stop is to lie down and let his blood become a colder thing. They held. He did not know for how long. Time became a cloak soaked in cold, heavy and without shape. When the pressure eased, it was not a victory so much as a pause. Men stood with their mouths open and their chests heaving, steam rising from them like fog off a river. John's hands trembled as he wiped Longclaw clean. He looked at Ghost, whose muzzle was dark and rimed, and Ghost looked back as if to say, "This is what we were born for." Not this thing, but the act of making something in the face of what undoes. Outside, the wind shifted. Snow began to fall, first in small cautious flakes and then in a soft rush. The world softened again, as if it had not tried to kill them. The others withdrew. The whites fell back and stood like an audience that had decided to come again tomorrow to see if the performance improved. John leaned his forehead against the cold of the wall and closed his eyes. He saw his father standing not on a green hill but upon the snow, blade bare, saying nothing because nothing needed saying when a thing had been done as it must. He saw Rob laughing and Arya running and Sansa sitting so straight in a chair that her bones must have hurt. He saw a boy he had been, angry and hungry and loving no less for it. He saw a man he was weary and hungry in another way. Between them there was no large difference, only a string of choices. Dolorous Ed touched his shoulder. "Still alive," he said with bleak satisfaction. "That's one in the eye to everyone who thought it would be better the other way. Some days will prove them right," John said. "Not today." They buried their dead in the frozen ground with picks that rang and shovels that complained. They burned the rest. They sat around fires and spoke little and ate too much and then not enough. Letters came and went. Children learned to string bows and then to pull them. The queen prayed and the Red Woman watched, and the men of the watch did the work that men could do. Ramsay sent another letter. John did not read it until he had time to split wood with his own hands. Then he read it and put it in the fire without cracking a smile. On a night when the sky held a wash of lights that draped the world in a shiver of green and violet, John walked the top of the wall alone. Ghost padded beside him. The ice hummed with old songs. He looked north. Somewhere beyond his sight line, a thing bent its head and listened for steps. He looked south. Somewhere beyond, Winterfell fires burned. Not the honest red of a hearth, but the spiteful orange of men pretending they could outshout the dark. He set his hand to Longclaw's pommel and let the familiar shape fill his palm with a steadiness that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with habit. He thought of the men whose blood he had spilled in the Shield Hall. He thought of a word he had almost made the Watch forget, and then honored it by saying it softly to himself like a vow. "Brother," he whispered into the cold. "Brother, brother." Ghost huffed, warm in the brutal air, and pressed against his thigh. Below, somewhere in the far white, an answering cry rose, not of wolf but of horn, low and long. It might have been wind. It might have been a warning. It might have been the night telling him that it had not yet decided whether to end neatly or scatter them drudging forward into another morning. When he descended, the yard was very quiet. Men slept with the clumsy tenderness of exhaustion. The Red Woman's shadow moved across the snow as she went to add a stick to a fire that did not need it. A boy whose name John could not remember sat with his head on his knees and did not cry because he had no tears left. John put a blanket over him and the boy startled and then sank again, closer to warmth. "Lord Commander," Ed said from the arch, his voice a scrape that had not been smoothed. "The dawn will be late today. It sent word that it's hung over. Then we stand until it comes sober," John said. He went out past the ditch where they had put men who had failed them and men whom they had failed. He stood under the half-familiar shape of the wall and breathed the air that held no scent but itself. He felt the ache in his right shoulder where the other spear had grazed him. It would be worse in an hour. He flexed his fingers against the cold. He felt the smallest mercy. They still moved. A raven landed on the post beside him and tilted its head. It croaked something that might have been a word and might not. "Snow," it said very distinctly, and then, "Snow, snow." "Aye," John said, "snow." He looked up at the white and the pale light and the long unpromised day, and knew what he had bought when he lifted his sword in the Shield Hall and cut men from the world. He had not bought safety. He had not bought peace. He had bought clarity, and the right to do the next necessary thing without being pulled limb from limb by two different vows set into two different winters. He turned toward the gate, and because he had made a habit of it, he smiled at Ed's grim face, and because he could not do otherwise, he went to work. The sound of men rising filled the yard, a rumble like a sea under ice. The wall groaned again, ancient and alive. In the north, the dark waited. In the south, the living did. Between them, Jon Snow stood with a blade that remembered what it had to do and a heart that did not forget why.